Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and friends of the Science Breakfasts. We've got a wonderful talk today, and in welcoming you to it, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, particularly important today because of the topic, but to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders past and present. A little bit of background. New South Wales as a state does tremendously well in what is the top, most difficult to get research grant program in Australia, the Australian Research Council Centres of Excellence. And the rounds only occur every blue moon. And when they do, there's a lot of excitement because they're right across top any given discipline and very strongly sought after. And in the most recent round that was finalised in 2016, I think that's right, one of the things that excited us was not just the list in New South Wales, but the topics. And one of the things we were most excited about was the centre at Wollongong. And because even the very best centres, a lot depends on all sorts of wonderful things. So we were really sweating when it went from the short list and then finally came out, because it's an unusual topic and a tremendously important topic in that it involves everybody, basically human evolution. And anybody who reads at all about science or knows about science knows about Bert Roberts, who's speaking today. You only have to mention Bert, and of course people say The Hobbit. He's not just a great scientist in the sort of standard tradition of science, although he's a geographer, so he sort of comes from a particularly interesting discipline in terms of the standard thinking of science. But he's great on bringing together disparate facts and using very sharp scientific logic, but also is a wonder in how he uses precise scientific instrumentation, and in his case, the work on dating with a particular focus on luminescence. And he's no stranger to controversy over human evolution and the work in Indonesia on the very small humanoid, the Hobbit. And he's now bringing all of that. He's always done a lot of work in Australia, but the centre particularly focuses on Australia. And the centre, called CABA in short, is the ARC Centre of Excellence in Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. And he's going to tell us about that centre. He's kindly brought some material. It'll be online afterwards. But again, it's a great story of science, and it has all the wonders of not just tugging at our heartstrings to know about our distant ancestors, but it's better than a detective story. Please welcome Bert Roberts.
Thanks, Mary. Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much for turning up so early this morning. So for the next 35 or 40 minutes, I'm going to take you through one of the ARCs, as Mary's just said, one of the new ARC's Centres of Excellence called the Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage. And for that, I'd like to thank, obviously, the Australian Research Council for their generous funding, and also Mary through the New South Wales Government Department of Industry, the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer. So, I'm based at Wollongong. But CABA, or for the Centre of Excellence in short, is very varied, and I'll get to in a moment who we actually are, where we're spread around the country, and what it is we're going to do. But fundamentally, it's about Australia's story, our epic story as a continent, how we got to be the way we are now, and where we might be heading in the future. Let's get to the next one. So these are the talking points over the next half hour or so. I'll be starting off with our motivation and 7-year mission. What actually started off CABA, and what is it we intend to do over that period of time? We'll be funded for the next 7 years, so we go through to 2023, which seems a long way away, but it'll soon be there, and we've got to crack on in the meantime. What are the teams we've assembled, and what are the themes we're actually going to take on through this period of time? We've actually only launched on the 22nd of June, so of course this talk won't be mostly about results, but I will be talking about some of the backdrop to CABA and some of the plans we're going to do and what we've already done a little bit already in the last 3 or so months. We'll be talking about some of the research questions we're going to engage in. Those are really what we're going to be focusing our efforts on. And for all of those, we get to the 4th point, which is a transdisciplinary and culturally inclusive approach to everything we do. Very often science can get siloed down into individual people being very good at something and being totally unaware of anything else around them. So we really want to break down those silos. Not particularly for researchers of my generation. You know, I'm too long in the tooth. I'll do whatever I'm doing. As it is, I'm fairly transdisciplinary. But for early career researchers, PhD students, all the young people coming through, we want them to take on a truly transdisciplinary approach to everything they do. Getting outside of the sciences, engaging with the social sciences, humanities, and with Indigenous people as well, through Indigenous knowledge systems. There are many ways in which this centre can do something different from other centres because we're so transdisciplinary in everything we do. That comes through with our education and engagement program as well, which I'll get onto later on. That's a major component of what CARBA will be doing, because of course there's no point telling ourselves what a wonderful story we've got. We've got to get it out there into the broader world and make sure everyone appreciates what a remarkable land we actually live in here in Australia. Around the world, people look at Australia and are always fascinated by what goes on down here, the natural history of our place, the cultural heritage of Australia. But we really want to get the message out and fill in the detail, and much of the detail we have no idea of at the moment at all, about what an amazing place Australia is. And then for all of you here, and I realise there are people from all sorts of walks of life, collaborative opportunities, because CARBA is just starting off now. So we really want to collaborate with people from a range of different disciplinary bases, different government agencies, different private industries, different academics as well. So we don't imagine we've got everyone on board who can contribute to this kind of multifaceted centre. So please, if you're interested in what we're doing, you see some common ground, please contact us. I've got my contact details up at the end, and I've also left some pamphlets at the door, which you're free to take away, and business cards for myself and the Chief Operating Officer of CARBA, so please take those too if you're interested. We're very happy to form collaboration throughout the 7-year life of the centre, so please just drop us a line. Let's get on to our motivation and mission. Really, our fundamental aim is to transform our understanding of Australia's human and environmental history. This is a massive task. It's an entire continent. We've only got 7 of those on Earth. And this is our job. We're Australians. We have to do it. Well, how are we going to do that? I'll roll out the plan in just a moment. And you might think we actually know a lot about Australia's environmental history already and our cultural heritage. We know bits. We actually know surprisingly little, frustratingly little. And when you actually put together what we do know, there are huge gaps in the tapestry of everything that's Australian. When you're looking at where we do know information, it's usually clustered around the coastal fringe. We know almost nothing about much of what's in Central Australia or Northern Australia. These are huge gaps in our knowledge. We've got to start filling in these gaps if we're to make any useful inferences about the way Australia has developed over time. As I just mentioned on the previous slide, we really want to unite the sciences and the humanities. These are the two cultures we need to bring together, and united as well with Indigenous knowledge systems. These have been forgotten, really, because this isn't just a Western science or even a Western philosophy approach to things. It's bringing in Indigenous people, so they're part of CARBA. They are a major contributor. It's as much theirs as it is ours, because, of course, the human history of Australia is fundamentally Indigenous history. So that's really what we've got to get out there, a fuller understanding of the way Indigenous people have interacted with the lands we see around us. It's their country, after all. And we also want, in the same vein, to train a new type of researcher. These are the early career researchers, the PhD students, somebody who can take on board this broad remit of all these different intellectual pursuits. Yes, somebody's got to be very good in one particular area. You've got to be a very good physicist, or a very good biologist, or a very good person who can read history. And you've got to do that, but you've also got to be aware of these other things happening around you at the same time. That's the kind of researcher we're going to need in Australia going forward. Not just people who are very good at one thing, but have a broad perspective on everything else happening around them. And of course, we want to communicate our epic story to the world. Yes, everyone knows we've got koalas and kangaroos and echidnas and platypuses and other weird animals, but we're more than just a kind of repository of weird and dangerous animals. We've got a fantastic cultural heritage. Some people realise that, but actually Australia was one of the first settled continents outside of Africa by modern humans. So we have a remarkably deep heritage in Indigenous culture in this country that's frankly the envy of the world. That's why we've got to get our story not just distributed around Australia so we appreciate the place we live in, but to get other people to appreciate the place we live in too. Sometimes I don't feel Australians do a very good job at that. And importantly, we also want to use the lessons in the past that we're going to be recreating to actually inform the future. History doesn't just stop now. So all the legacy events that happened in the past, all the trajectories, the environmental trajectories that led to this point in time, are still carrying forward. And on top of that are new events happening. A warming world. That's getting superimposed on top of a bunch of legacies that are continuing through a series of contingent events that were already set in train tens of thousands of years ago. So let's try and at least work out what those contingent events are and where they're taking forward. And then we can implant and make useful modeling efforts to work out where we're going to go in the future. So that could hopefully inform policy moving forwards. Let me talk a little bit about how we're structured. Then we'll get on to the more interesting things about what we're actually going to do. But this is the sort of the structure of the centre. These are our major Australian nodes. These are the Australian universities. We're headquartered at the University of Wollongong, down here. And there we have myself. I'm a geomorphologist, geochronologist, archaeological scientist, whatever you want to call me. I cross over many different fields. We also have Amanda Lawson, who actually heads up our education and engagement program. She's from the arts sector. She works in museology as well. So we're already crossing over between the sciences and the humanities. We have other geochronologists, other geomorphologists at Wollongong. Up at James Cook University, both up in Cairns and Townsville, we have Indigenous studies experts. We have geochronologists, geochemists, and archaeologists. In University of New South Wales, I mean, there's red dots around here somewhere. Let's get down here. There we go. Down here, we also have climate scientists, paleoanthropologists, science communication experts. At ANU in Canberra, we have archaeologists, paleoecologists. Down in Hobart, Tasmania, we also have wildlife experts, ecological modelers. We have ecological modelers at the University of Adelaide and Flinders University, as well as geneticists and whole organism zoologists. And at Monash University, we have archaeologists, historians. We've got a range of expertise spread throughout, particularly the eastern seaboard of the continent. And we need that range of expertise. And in amongst that expertise, we've got some very good people. We've got 5 active ALC Laureate Fellows, plenty of ALC Future Fellows, and these are people who are dedicated to doing research and have very good facilities and access to facilities to do that research. So we're very well kitted out in terms of the infrastructure we need to carry out the centre's ambitions, which are extremely ambitious. So these are our university centres. By the way, this map, which I haven't hardly mentioned, is... I'll get to at the very end, but don't get distracted by that quite yet, because I want to mention, importantly, our other partner organisations. These are ones who are not based at universities, but are going to really add value to CARBA in a huge way. These are really our outreach agencies and particular agencies that can give us leverage in certain areas. The Australian Museum, the Queensland Museum, State Library in New South Wales, just next to here, of course, and the South Australian Museum. These are big outreach partners for us. This is one way in which we're going to be able to communicate to the Australian public through these large museums and get together museum exhibitions to send around Australia and the world. Also, Bioplatforms Australia, which is a life sciences infrastructural organisation, is throwing in support as well. And smaller, local Scarp Archaeology, which is a local consulting firm. We'll have a few of those over time. So we're trying to link in with as many people who've got common interests as us. This isn't just a university-led thing. This is actually led as much by our partner organisations as it is by the universities themselves. And this map is actually just produced by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies many years ago now, but it shows Indigenous languages, social or nation groups. And the point of it is, you can't read anything on it. It's simply notice the many colours of the map and how segmented it is. So when we talk about Indigenous communities, there are many, many Indigenous communities who recognise themselves as nation groups. So it's not just some homogenous whole of Indigenous society. There are many sorts of Indigenous communities, just like there are many kinds of Western societies. That's sometimes forgotten, but it makes a big difference because it means there are regional distinctions and regional differences throughout Australia in the way Indigenous people deal and treat their own country. In terms of international partners, of course, we have several of those as well, and they serve useful functions. If we go straight to our nearest northern neighbours, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, on I'll mention in a moment why they're particularly important. In Indonesia, we're working with the National Research Centre for Archaeology, the same people I worked with on Hobbits many years ago and still do now, the University of Papua New Guinea and the PNG Museum and Art Gallery. Of course, the latter is going to be very useful for outreach activities as well. In Europe, we have the Natural History Museum in Copenhagen, Natural History Museum in London, the Smithsonian Institution, all big outreach partners in Europe and North America, because we want to have a footprint. We want to be able to take things to North America and to Europe and say, hey, look, we're Australia. This is what we're doing. This is the way we've been, and this is where we're going. We want to make an impact that goes beyond just our own shores and Asia. And we also have some specialist research institutes, University of Savoy here in France, also Natural History Museum in Denmark, University of Colorado in Boulder, and the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder. They're all earth sciences and climate science institutes that can bring particular expertise that we don't have in here in Australia. We can use them as part of CARBA. So they're partners with us as well because they have particular expertise, as does Harvard over here in the US. At the Max Planck Institute, which is Science for Human History, they've got good genetics facilities that we'll also be able to leverage off. So we're working with particular partners. Of course, we could fill the world with partners, but ultimately you just want to make sure you're working with those who you really need, who can bring something different to the centre we don't already have here in Australia. So here's how the team is at the moment. We have 27 collaborating organisations around Australia and the world. There are 18 chief investigators. Those are the people based at Australian universities. And we have 15 Australian and international partners, either as individuals or as organisations. And we've got 11 other participants who are bringing particular expertise to the centre, and that number will be growing. You might be amongst the growing number. So like I say, if you have common interests with us, please contact us. You can end up being an associate investigator or an associate organisation. We really want to make CARBA a success, which means bringing on board as many people as possible who've got related interests to us. The current team consists of, before I get there, researchers and educators, principally in the natural sciences, on the sciences side. That's earth and climate sciences, ecology and genetics. Yes, we have some physics in there. I do a little bit of solid state physics as well. But fundamentally, we're earth sciences and the biological sciences. And of course, we've got people over there in the humanities and the arts, archaeology, indigenous studies and museology. So like I say, from the get-go, we're combining the sciences and the humanities, and we have indigenous studies, indigenous researchers, 2 centres up at JCU and Monash, fully engaged with what we're doing. So to actually deal with our research plan, we've broken it down into different themes. These are sort of fairly self-apparent. There's humans, because we're dealing with human heritage. Climate, landscapes, wildlife, time, because everything's a matter of time when you're looking back at history. And the glue in the middle, which is perhaps the most important of the lot, is models. Because when you're dealing with very patchy data, you have to fill in the gaps somehow. You do that through modelling. And to make a useful model, you have to get enough data to make the model valid and realistic. And of course, if we're making future predictions based on past events, that's a modelling situation. So if you're going to develop useful models, all of these need to contribute to the models. And the models is really the synthetic part of the entire centre. And that's a very important component of what we're doing. But of course, we want to fuse these themes across all the different nodes and cultures. The different nodes are those Australian universities and our partner organisations. We want to make sure that these are fully integrated across each of the nodes and across the 2 cultures, as it were, of sciences, humanities, and of course, indigenous knowledge systems as well. This has got to be a proper integration from the get-go. So we're sending researchers between nodes all the time on researcher exchanges so they can each learn the language of a different discipline. So if you're a geneticist, you can go and spend 3 months at an archaeological institute to work out what they actually do. Rather than just taking their word for it, you think, okay, that's what archaeologists actually do with their time. This is how they think. And the same with geomorphologists, the same with a geochemist. You can send them to a completely different kind of centre to actually learn the language of different disciplines. Only then will we get a truly transdisciplinary researcher. And that is our transdisciplinary research training program, is to actually make this happen. And we have various programs in place to send people around the country to learn these different languages, as it were. Okay, let's get on to some research questions. This is a map of Australia as it was 65,000 years ago. The bits in green are dry land. And as you can see, we were joined to Papua New Guinea and parts of Indonesia. In fact, we've been joined to parts of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea for most of the last 130,000 years. In fact, most of the last 2.5 million years. And the reason being that sea level has been lower than it is now. Sea level is pretty much at its highest for that period of time. So if you think of Australia as being much larger than it is now, quite a bit larger, you could walk all the way from PNG to Australia, no trouble. It could have been a bit squelchy in parts here, going through the Arafura Shelf, but it was completely dry land in that sense. I'll refer to this one now, and then we'll flick back to the map. This is actually a little plot going from 140,000 years ago here on the left-hand side through to the present day over here. And on this scale, it's effectively a climate signal. It's actually obtained from an Antarctic ice core because we don't have anything comparable like this in Australia, whereas warmer, higher up the scale, and it gets progressively cooler as you go down the scale. As you can see from about 130,000 years ago, it's pretty much as warm as it was now. But it's been generally cooler throughout the world for most of the remaining period of time, because that's a glacial period, and we're in an interglacial period. This is also a proxy for sea level. Sea level was highest about then, and then it's been lower at these other periods of time. So you can see for most of the last 100,000 years, sea level has been much lower than it is now, and Australia, as you see it now, is really hardly the same as Australia as it has been for most of the last 130,000 years. On our current best estimates, we think people arrived on this continent maybe 65,000 years ago. I'll get back to that bit in just a moment. So that's a very different point in time from what it is now, and that's why we've been joined, when people first arrived, to Papua New Guinea and this part of Indonesia. Now, on the other side of this watery mass, which I'll get to in a moment, this is all called Sahul, this large land mass, this mega continent. And on the other side is one called Sunda, which is really the expanded land mass of Asia. Because at low sea levels, what happens is, of course, the continental shelf gets exposed, everything gets expanded. In fact, Sumatra, Java, all the way to Bali, and Borneo, they're all attached to Asia. You can walk all the way to Bali. You don't have to take a plane there at all, which is why there are tigers on Bali, because they can easily get to Bali. But then there's the Wallace's Line. That's named after Alfred Russel Wallace. Of course, the famous biogeographer who, with Charles Darwin, came up with a theory of evolution for natural selection. And this line here is named after him, Wallace's Line. And it's a major biogeographical boundary between the Asian fauna and flora and the Australian fauna and flora. Now, if you can cross Wallace's Line, you're home free. You can get all the way to Australia, no trouble. If you can hop over on one island, you can hop over another 5 islands to get all the way to Australia. So the remit of Kaba is Sahul and this area here, which is sometimes called Wallacea, again after Alfred Russel Wallace. This is called Lydecker's Line, and it defines a kind of eastern boundary of Wallacea. This has always been a watery maritime continent. So that's been a different kettle of fish from Australia, which of course is a massive continent. But these two, Sahul and Wallacea, are the geographic area of interest for Kaba. That's a large part of the planet we're dealing with. And this is our time frame of interest, the last 130,000 years. The reason being, if people arrived about 65,000 years ago, the first half was not occupied by people at all. But we still don't really know what Australia was like during that interval of time. This is the period of time in which you might say Australia was in its natural state, if there is such a thing. Because remember that the climate was still changing over that interval, and therefore things have been quite different throughout Australia, even before people arrived. And of course, regionally, there are huge differences as well. Up here, we're in the monsoonal tropics. Down here, we're in Tasmania, which was joined to the mainland. That's subalpine or temperate. And of course, in the middle of Sahul, we've got deserts. So Australia is hugely variable in terms of its climatic regional history. And it'd be ridiculous to expect that the Aboriginal history of this country would be any simpler than the environmental history of this country. So we've broken it down into 5 questions. The first question is, what was Australia like before people even arrived? The second question is, when people did arrive, how did they adapt to their new environment? They just come through Southeast Asia and arrived in northern Australia. How did they adapt to this brand new continent they'd never seen before? No one else was in it at this point in time. And for that matter, how did the fauna and flora respond to the arrival of people? It goes both ways. So the third question is, what were the impacts and aftershocks of human arrival? As we know in other parts of the world, usually when people arrive, something changes. Things very rarely stay the same. Sometimes it's for good, sometimes it's not so good. So the impacts and aftershocks matter. A very simple example is we know for a fact we used to have a whole different range of animals and plants here in Australia. At some time in the past, we used to have giant kangaroos, giant wombats, things like diprotodons, and a complete different range of giant marsupials, reptiles, and birds that are no longer with us. We can argue about exactly why they disappeared and when they disappeared. They might have disappeared as recently as 40,000 years ago. But the fact of the matter is, we haven't actually got an absolutely definitive answer to that question at the present stage, and that's something we want to do as part of Kaba. Then, of course, we descend right into the height of the last ice age about 20,000 years ago. The Northern Hemisphere and Antarctica, they had big expanded ice sheets. What happened in Australia? The answer is we don't know. People are still arguing about whether it actually got wetter or drier at that particular point in time. We really need to get an answer to that question, because a lot of those things, as soon as you start coming out of the glacial maximum, up until the present, you're coming out, Australia's probably warming up, and we know that Aboriginal populations expanded massively during that period of time. So what are the legacies of that expansion and coming out of that last great ice age? These are the questions that are really going to keep us busy for the next 7 years. Let's start off with some fairly straightforward questions about our origins and transformations. Which route did people take through what is now Indonesia? Did they fly north, as it were, through Borneo, Sulawesi, maybe through the Bird's Head of Papua New Guinea and come in through northern Australia? Or did they fly low, going through Java, Flores, through Timor, and then maybe into Arnhem Land or the Kimberley? We don't know. We don't know the answer to that question. It's as simple as that. The reason is people haven't done enough exploration in that area, and it's a very difficult area to explore for a number of reasons. But we're exploring, and I'll get back to that towards in the next few slides. Of course, when did people then arrive in Australia? That's still a moot point. Just a few weeks ago, there was a paper published that said, which I was involved with many other people, including Chris Clarkson here from the University of Queensland, who led this study, and the dating was done by one of the chief investigators in Kaba, Zenobia Jacobs, based at the University of Wollongong. And this is a site up here, Majabibi, up in the very far north of the Northern Territory, just outside Kakadu National Park. It's actually just inside the Jabiluka mine lease area. That was about 65,000 years old for the very earliest traces of Aboriginal occupation of that site. It's quite a bit the oldest site in the continent. Other ones, there's some other ones up here in the northeast part of the Northern Territory, Naulala Gabmang, Naulabla, and there are other ones out here, Budi Cave, Riwi, Devil's Lair, Warachi, Lake Mungo. They're somewhere between maybe 45 and 55,000 years old. So Majabibi, 65,000 years old, it's quite a bit older. Is that the only one of its kind, or are there other ones of that sort around there? Is that the earliest date that people actually arrived on the continent? We don't know the question. At the moment, we're speculating that this is the case as it is now. But of course, every time, archaeology is one of those disciplines where a brand new discovery can really turn everything on its head instantaneously. So you can't afford to get too cozy in your interpretations of how you think the world was, because all it takes is one discovery and you can chuck all of that away. So we really want to concentrate up here in the north, because people almost certainly came through the north somewhere. Let's really put a lot of work drilling up here in the north to see what we can find by way of early archaeological sites and other environmental traces of human arriving. Humans might have come arrived. Did they start burning the landscape straight away? Can we detect evidence of that burning in the landscape out of lake cores, out of some of the chemicals preserved in those lake sediments? That's one of the things, obviously, we're doing at the present stage. And also, doing a lot more digging up here in Indonesia. I mean, Papua New Guinea is one of the countries I think is going to be one of the most exciting ones to try and explore over the next 7 years. And what do we know about Papua New Guinea's early archaeology? Almost nothing, and yet it's a huge slab of the Earth's crust. There's got to be some fabulous discoveries to be found there, and up here in the Bird's Head area. Well, what happened afterwards? That's just as important as when did people first arrive. In a sense, that's just putting a number on things, but what really matters is what happened when people arrived. Unfolding those events is why we need to have biologists, geneticists, ecologists, geomorphologists involved in Kaba. And why should we care? Because all of those events that happened in the past are living with us today, and they're going to continue forward into the future. When we lost all those megafauna, all those giant mammals, what did that mean about all the browse that happened in Australia? The vegetation's changed at the same time because we've lost all those herbivores. So the Australia you see today is actually quite different from things even 40,000 years ago, let alone before indigenous people arrived on this continent. And the last thing I want to mention on this slide is this site of Majabibi. Here we're working not just in partnership with the Aboriginal communities, the Mirarr people, but this is their dig. This is effectively their story. They dictate the terms of the excavation. We don't do anything unless they want us to do it. And when we go out onto all of these sites as part of Kaba, it's not just us saying, can we have approval to please do what we want to do? We ask the question, what is it you want us to do for you? It's got to be a two-way conversation. We've got to lift it out of being, here I am to do my thing, to do my project, and say, we can do something for you. What is it you want to get out of us as scientists, social scientists, and humanities scholars? So let's just take a little flip from the oceans to the outback. Here we are now back in Southeast Asia. Here we are with Borneo, there's Java over here, Northern Australia, here's Majabibi, and here's West Papua. This is the coastline as it was 65,000 years ago. And the dark blue areas are ones that are also visible from the shore. How far out can you see from where you are now to decide, oh, let's travel over there? And the light blue areas are ones where you have to leave in the boat, you can look back and see where you've left, and you can see the next bit of land going forward. So you can still see land on both directions. So in a sense, it's an intervisibility plot. And all I want to say is that there are routes you can get to Australia, either through Papua, by going through Sulawesi. You can island hop all the way along, and you can see islands all the way through. You don't have to actually ever go out of sight of land to get to West Papua 65,000 years ago. Or you can come traipsing along the bottom here, and maybe you've got to do a little bit of drifting or sailing to get to Northern Australia if you're going to go through Timor. But not far. You can actually drift all the way from Timor to Northern Australia without too much trouble, because the currents go in those particular directions. And these are some possible routes people take, and this is work done by another of our chief investigators, Sue O'Connor at the Australian National University and her group there. I put on Wallace's Line here, just to show if you can cross over Wallace's Line, it's a pretty easy route all the way to Australia. But we know there's some other people already living on this other side of Wallace's Line. There are stone tools here at a site in Sulawesi that are about 100,000 years old. We don't know who made them because there are no human remains, but someone was living on Sulawesi before modern people came running through the region. Through here, we know there are hobbits living there up until about 50,000 years ago, little people, maybe only a metre high. So if our ancestors were coming through here 65,000 years ago, there's a good chance they would have met a hobbit on their travels on the way through. Who knows what those encounters were like? If they ever did encounter a hobbit, we don't know, but we want to know within the next 7 years. Once they got here, how do we then spread out around the continent? Perhaps we just got in here in the northwest corner and radiated outwards. Or we came in through Papua New Guinea and went around in a clockwise spiral. Or perhaps we came in the northwest and did the same. Or a pincer movement. We come in the top and go down both coasts simultaneously. These are models, and of course there are more models than there are good data sets. And this is something we really need to stop, because otherwise we can speculate till the cows come home and we're none the wiser. We're just making up lovely stories. So we really want to get some evidence base behind some of these models to test them, put up hypotheses, and provide data sets that can actually destroy some of these hypotheses so we're left behind with the most plausible ones. So how are we going to do that? Well, one way is to actually model based on what we know now. This is a work done by a couple of our chief investigators at James Cook University, Michael Bird and Sean Alm. What they did was they got a map produced by Geoscience Australia, which is of permanent water availability currently in Australia, so the situation as it is now. How far have you got to travel to get to water? The deeper the blue, the shorter the distance. And they also said, okay, well, how easy is it to traverse over the terrain? If you're going uphill, you're going to need more effort. If it's flat, you need less effort. So let's now put those two together. Distance to water and easiness of traversing the terrain. Put those two together. The most efficient way to get around Australia is to go that way and that way. That's the least cost path of travelling around Australia. Now, of course, that's a sort of simplistic model in a sense, because it's based on very few assumptions, and it's based on the more modern water distribution. It's not based on the paleo water distribution 65,000 years ago, because we don't know what that is. So we get round into this sort of closed loop. But at least it gives us some indication that here's a hypothesis we can test. It's going to be a pincer-type movement around the edges. We'd expect to see the older sites up north and younger going around in that direction. And the effects also of people arriving would be the same. Is it the same with other indicators? This is work done by our genetics group at the University of Adelaide and the South Australian Museum based on historic hair samples, which is Alan Cooper and his group down there. He combined genetic data based on his work on those Aboriginal hair samples with archaeological data and had access to water in that upper plot. And he also observed a kind of pincer movement. And importantly, when people got into these different regions, which they might have done quickly, they stayed in those regions. So very strong regional continuity after settling a region, first of all. So the regional continuity is important, as is the regional distinction in different parts of Australia, because that makes it one region in which, if we're going to do an informed exploration, we need to take that regionality into account. So we've broken it down into 5 very broad regions: the northwest, the northeast, southwest, southeast, and something in the middle. And in each of those regions, we have site clusters. Those site clusters give us something to get a handle on to actually work out what was going on in each of those places, both on the human side and on the environmental side. So we have regional targets in each of these broad 5 regions. Our tier 1 targets are really our highest priority targets. We know these are going to be good sites to work because people have done pilot studies there before and they found some interesting findings, but they never managed to pursue it. Maybe they ran out of money, or they did it a long time ago. But now we've got much better technology. We can really answer the question you couldn't have answered 10 years ago. So those are the low-hanging fruit, really, the ones we can pick off easily and have just been waiting to be done. We can actually now finally do it. Our tier 2 sites are the high potential sites. These are ones that, based on field reconnaissance and database surveys, people think, well, this should really be a really good one to go look at. Let's go and do that one. No one has so far, but we can ground truth those sites when we're excavating these sites. So tiers 1 and tier 2 are our top 2 series of priority sites. Our third ones are more blue sky. These ones have got new prospects. They should be something good. For example, in the Pilbara, it turns out the water access is pretty good, actually. We haven't really dug that many sites in the Pilbara. Maybe we should go and put more effort into the Pilbara, which is actually why we're working closely with Scarp Archaeology, because they do work in the Pilbara. So based on the remote sensing and modelling, we would suggest that these are areas we should concentrate some efforts that people have not done so much in the past. So these are the way in which we're organising our activities. And in fact, we've already started. So since we launched ourselves on the 22nd of June, we've already headed off and started making excavations in certain areas, new field sites, new records, digging through archives, finding out new things. We've done reconnaissance surveys in several areas as well. We're concentrating on the north for the reasons I've already mentioned, and we're also concentrating down here, mostly in terms of reconnaissance and community consultations. The community consultation is absolutely paramount. It can take 1, 2, 3 years. It can take many years to get Indigenous communities to feel that you're welcome on their country. So that's something you need to start early. You can't just suddenly rock up on February and say, hi, we'd like to come back in June or July. Does that work for you? The answer will be no, it doesn't work for us. Come back and see us in another few months. The conversation must keep going. It's a trust-based thing. So you've got to establish trust. You've got to show you're doing the right things and you really do want to work with Indigenous communities. You're not just there to do a smash and grab on their country. So the community consultations start right now, even if we're not going to be doing excavations until year 5. And we started off doing some new research collaborations already. Just a few weeks ago, we had an ARC linkage project that was approved to work on rock art up here in the Kimberley. That's with some new collaborators of ours at the University of Melbourne and the Kimberley Foundation, Australia. Now, we didn't feed in rock art to our original CARBA application, but it's something we'd like to do because it's a perfectly legitimate form of archaeological evidence that informs us about the way people were thinking in the past. So rock art is now one of the things we're doing up here in the Kimberley with a bunch of new collaborators. One thing we do want to get across is that it's adventure and opportunity. This isn't just a sterile laboratory exercise. You can actually have fun doing what we're doing. We like to call it STEM by stealth. Lots of people are leaving STEM because it's perceived as being boring and dull and not just 95% perspiration and 5% of inspiration, but 100% perspiration and no inspiration. So we want to change that around to make it actually a lot more fun to do STEM than perhaps people realize. Like I say, we're doing all the natural sciences and many of the physical sciences in what we're doing. So there's ways to get people into STEM without them even realizing they're doing STEM. This is a project that Mike Bird and myself had to do. We were having to get ourselves into a sinkhole to collect some lake cores. I'll notice for the OH&S aficionados, we are wearing helmets on while we're abseiling in. So it's completely okay. But we do other things. This is archaeological work in Northern Australia, Indonesia, coring in Lake Eyre, more archaeological work, more lake work. There's lots of outdoor fieldwork activities. So if you're an outdoors kind of person, the stuff we do is fully STEM, and yet you actually get to have fun at the same time. But if you're a nerd, and I'm a bit of a nerd as well, there's plenty of nerdy stuff too. So I do stuff in a luminescence lab that's sort of lit like this, a bit like an old photographic darkroom. It's because we have to work out when sediments were last exposed to sunlight. That's actually the dating clock, so we have to keep the lights right down in the laboratory. And for that, we work out when artifacts and fossils were buried in the ground. That's something we do at the University of Wollongong. This is Rachel Wood, one of our associate investigators at the Australian National University. She works on radiocarbon dating. She runs a lab there. So we have all sorts of dating techniques for answering different questions in different places. We've got a genetics lab, University of Adelaide and our overseas partner organisations, and we've got geochemical facilities throughout the country and overseas. We're well kitted out for doing what it is we need to do in the sort of laboratory space and in the modelling space. So let me sort of finish off with things about the communications and impacts we want to do. That's our research program. We're going to do great research anyway. We know we're going to do great research, but that's not enough. It can't just be a research centre producing great research. We've actually got to engage with other people. This is part of our education and engagement program, which will be led by Amanda Lawson at the University of Wollongong, Martin Nakata at James Cook University, Darren Kerno just over here at UNSW in particular, and Chantal Knowles up at the Queensland Museum. And these are all our industry partners who are sort of helping us out in that outreach space, and really they're the main drivers of our outreach. We can't do this through universities as such. Universities aren't necessarily particularly the right places to drive a lot of this outreach, not to the general population. But the Australian Museum and Queensland Museum, South Australian Museum, State Library, and all of our overseas partner organisations, they really will give us a foothold in a much more general public space. We want to be producing educational materials for schools. In particular, we really do want to get into curricula, because that's how we're going to change young minds as to the way Australia was, is, and may be in the future. That's where we can really make, I think, the greatest effect. We also want to have lots of on-country activities with Indigenous communities, because it's all very easy doing things in the metropolitan centres, but of course Indigenous communities live out there, on country, in the rural area as well. So we need to be doing stuff not just in the city centres, but out there in rural areas of Australia. We'll have an artist in residence program. We'll have a range of digital and traditional media, as everyone does this day, but we're trying to make it as outward looking as possible for us. We'll have exhibitions and major events. Exhibitions, we'll have a travelling exhibition that goes around Australia and indeed the world. And major events such as the World Science Festival, which the Queensland Museum is hosting, which the Queensland Museum is hosting for the next few years. We'll be part of that. I think the next one's in March of next year. So please come along to that. It's held in Brisbane and a few other places up in Queensland. But it's a big event. That's the World Science Festival. There's obviously National Science Week and other local events too that CABA is going to be contributing to. But we don't want it to be just about science. We want it to be beyond science. So that's why we have the Artist in Residence program. And of course we want to have a big Indigenous footprint too. So one of our schools is the Tagai State College, which we're affiliated with through Martin Nakata at James Cook University. That's an Indigenous school system in the Torres Strait. We've got very good schools connections through the State Library in New South Wales, throughout New South Wales. Through the Queensland Museum, we've got very, very good connections with the Queensland schools there too. And we really want to get into schools as best we can in those two states, because if we can do it right there in Queensland and New South Wales, we can roll that out for the rest of the country. And importantly, just before I leave this slide, is the evaluation of our impact. This is a research activity in its own right, showing how much impact we're actually having. Not just assuming we're having an impact, but actually recording and quantifying how much impact we're going to have. Oh, what happened there? There we go. We're going to be doing this face-to-face, of course. We actually got to get out there in the field. This is in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Australia, actually dealing with people on country, meeting them face to face. You can't just do all of this electronically in this digital age. You've actually got to go out and meet people. And of course, this is in the country, this is in the town. We'll have to have stuff here in the city centres as well, because that's where the major populations live. Yes, we've got online platforms too. Our website, official website, www.epicaustralia.org, will go live in a week or so. It's almost ready to go. I was hoping it had already gone, but not quite there. Very, very, very soon. It's called Australia's Epic Story, hence epicaustralia.org. Of course, we've got Facebook and Twitter accounts too. They're already up and running. Facebook is very important because that's how Indigenous communities communicate with each other, mostly through Facebook. So that's, for Indigenous communities, this is far more important than this or this. So Facebook matters to us. And I'm just going to finish off with how CABA is going to be also safeguarding our future in the best way possible. This is to do with, for example, our environmental health. We're going to be trying to establish past patterns of environmental change and the process responsible for them. For example, one of our CIs here, Chris Turney at the University of New South Wales, is creating a drought atlas for Eastern Australia. That is the last few hundred years of most extreme droughts, which you can get out of tree cores. What's actually happened in Eastern Australia? We want to spread that across the whole of Australia. That gives us last few hundreds of years of records. And through our other activities, we're going to be stretching back through the last few thousands of years of records. This gives us some trajectories of what was happening in the past. We can now check test climate models. How well do they perform on reproducing those past climate records? Did they get it right or did they not get it right? Once we've got those climate records tuned, those climate models tuned, we can start to advance them forwards in time with new climate simulations as to what might be happening going forward. So this should inform policy by actually using climate models as a test bed on our collected data sets for what really did happen and moving it forward in time to what might happen in the future. And of course, all our data sets are going to be open access because they need to be these days. Everything's accessible so other people can reuse the data for their own purposes and modelling efforts. And this is the final slide, which is just, we want to have societal impacts, clearly. We want to help document and celebrate our Indigenous heritage in partnership with Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders. Indigenous heritage is really fundamental to the raison d'etre for our centre and to showcase our cultural heritage to the world. And we want to help create Australia's next future leaders. We want to contribute to, as I said, the school curricula and the National Innovation and Science Agenda. And we need to create that culturally inclusive, transdisciplinary mindset as best we can in school kids and ECRs, and indeed everyone here in the room as far as possible. And of course, we want to inspire more women and Indigenous Australians because they're so underrepresented in academia, but generally in the research workforce. And to promote the excitement and adventure of exploration and discovery. It's actually fun what we're doing, as well as being informative, useful. So STEM by stealth, we like to call it, as one way to attract people to doing what we're doing and still being of value to the nation moving forwards. So I'll leave you with this one. Do you want to know more, or if you wish to collaborate with us, please grab some of the stuff at the back, or contact me or Julie Matarzik anytime you like, or when our website goes up very, very soon, please just go straight onto there and we'll have all our contact details there too. So thank you very much for coming this morning, and I'm very happy to take questions or stay on afterwards.
Thanks, Bert. That's most exciting. And we have time for a couple of questions. And I first of all we're very honoured to have the Minister for Education here, Rob Stokes. Rob, I don't know if you had a comment or anything about it. Putting you on the spot.
Well, no, just, I was fascinated by the transdisciplinary approach and the idea of working across disciplines, which is something that I'm very keen to see how we can do in the school sector as well, to try and join our curriculum up to make, as you say, future leaders who are able to work across different disciplines and also making STEM exciting. That sounds good too.
Let's talk. That sounds perfect. I mean, it's just, I think it's so necessary for so many reasons, and it's habit to break things down into disciplinary boundaries, and it's convenient to do it in many ways, but it really doesn't help. And it goes everywhere from schools through to even the ARC, which tends to evaluate things by panels, because that's what we're used to. Well, we just have to change the norm. That can't be the norm going forwards, because we're not creating the right kinds of people to address wicked problems, effectively, ones that require people coming at it from many different angles. You can't do that. It's taking this very, very siloed approach. No matter how good you are in a silo, and assembling teams of people who are very singular still doesn't quite do it, because they don't understand each other's other languages, and that's where the breakdowns happen, at the interfaces between the disciplines. So if we can break that down, absolutely, I think that's really the way to progress forward fast.
Bert, oh yes, that's very good. Bert, one thing about that, I wondered about citizen science, about people who want to contribute to the centre, or school kids or whatever.
Yep.
So are there opportunities?
Yes, and we're still working on how we're going to roll out a citizen science program to make it manageable for us. And particularly when we're going on to Indigenous country, there are all sorts of other issues there. We've got to work with communities to make sure they really do want this to happen. Where will it end? There's lots of sensitivities involved in that. It's easier on the environmental history side. So we're going to come up with a plan. Please keep your eye on the website. That's one way in which we'll be actually asking people to be involved with CARBA directly. But certainly we will be doing citizen science programs.
That's very exciting. So questions? No, you all know all about it. Chris? Michael's coming here. Yeah.
I'll speak. I just wonder if there's a technology advancement component in your population migration studies. In other words, better boats, ability to carry water, better food preparation, better instruments to kill with. Are you looking at the technology side?
Yes, so in terms of sort of prehistoric technology, is that what you mean? Yes. We know very little at the moment about what the technology was of the first Indigenous occupants of this country. Of course, for a number of reasons. The stone tools are really what gets left behind most of the time at archaeological sites. And perishable materials, such as wooden vessels or bamboo, are lost completely from the record. Organic remains are generally very poorly preserved. So people could have been using very sophisticated organic materials to do things that we consider to be standard fare. They're lost completely from the archaeological record. And you're left behind with a, frankly, fairly uninspiring set of stone tools on many occasions. That's why the rock art is a very interesting alternative way to look at it, because you can see from the decorations on many rock panels in the Kimberley and Arnhem Land, people had incredibly sophisticated rituals and cultures, and simply recording those in its own right, which many groups around the country are doing really well, is actually a really great insight into the way people used to live their lives back in the past. But tying in the rock art into what we observe in the ground, that's the link we need to make. How can you date that rock art on the rock face and link it to what we observe in the ground? So we need to relate the ground archaeology to the rock art on the rock face. Then we'll have a much more complete understanding of the way Indigenous people really did interface with the country around them, their environment around them, and the sorts of artifacts that they themselves were using.
I may have misheard, but I thought you'd said the industry partners included the museums and so on, which I'm not sure I'd call them industry partners. They're mainly government agencies. I'm just wondering whether you're allowed to, and whether you've considered actual industry partners from the mining and resources sector and other areas, whether there's a conflict of interest. Are you allowed to do that through centres of excellence? Yeah. And if so, is that something that can be explored?
Certainly. I mean, there's no reason why we can't work with any. I appreciate that the museums are in that sort of government. As far as the ARC are concerned, they count as industry partners. But I realise from a industry point of view, you consider them to be a government outshoot. Certainly, would straightforward industry partners, absolutely. We're happy to work with industry partners who've got related interests to us. That's all it amounts to. There's a certain time frame in which we had to operate to get these applications put in. Otherwise, we could have spent more time. If we had a year to go around organising exactly who we'd like to work with in different areas, then we probably would have come up with more industry partners. But this is something we can do at this point in time. In the Pilbara in particular, there's some really, most of that is really mining lease areas. Scarp Archaeology, as an outfit, is very helpful for us because they work with a lot of mining agencies in that area. It's a difficult space in some way because we obviously want to be releasing certain information about what we find in the public domain, and some of that may not be of interest to the mining organisation itself. So some of this, there's a little bit of a negotiation that has to take place there. But in general, there's not a huge problem. So I think that's something we will be sort of doing a lot more of going forward. And we need to be touching base. Sometimes it's because, perhaps I'm too ignorant of who I should be talking to, and I need to educate myself about maybe there's an organisational group I can get in touch with, and through that, go and give a talk like this to mining companies, say, here's what we're going to do. Would any of you like to take part in what we're doing? Because we're interested in collaborating with people. There's no limits as far as the ARC are concerned with who we work with.
Yes, last question, Jules.
I just wondered whether you have any collaborations at the moment looking at the role of pathogens, so in both the animal and the human interactions, which infectious diseases surely must have had some big ancient impacts, and many of the pathogens that we know now have been around for a very, very long time. So I wondered if you're looking at that at the moment, or whether you plan to do that.
That's a very interesting, and you're right. People have sort of said, well, your diseases, what's been the effect? We haven't actually formally involved that throughout, so that'd be a very interesting area to investigate as a side branch. There are many sort of side projects we can take on board to say, let's feed this into on the genetic side or the microbiota side, which is being run out of Adelaide and our other partners, but not specifically on the pathogen side. But that would be a very interesting one to pursue because, of course, that's often how you get decimation of large populations in a hurry, and then you're left behind with the residual population that's effectively biologically dead because the population numbers are so low. So, yes, I'd be happy to, catch up afterwards and talk about that.
Yourself afterwards. That's a very good one. We'd probably better wrap up the questions. And we should thank Bert for a truly wonderful talk. There's a book which you can share with your collaborators all around Australia, and here's something for you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you. all the very best with it. You know, we're really excited about this, and you know, it's just wonderful to hear how much you've done in such a short time. It's a big centre and a really big topic. So thank you. Just a couple of announcements for coming up. We're very much into research breakfast series at the moment, so we've just heard Bert. Then on the 9th of November, we've got a special one coming in that's sponsored not only by the Office of the Chief Scientist and Engineer, but also by the Innovation and Productivity Council and the School of Entrepreneurship. And that's Peter Svensson from Vinnova, the Swedish Innovation Agency, and he's the main policy person from Vinnova. And Peter's going to talk about innovation and openness, with particularly looking at lessons for New South Wales. Peter looks at national systems, particularly studying Sweden and the US, but it was Peter who said he thought the idea of the School of Entrepreneurship, the Stockholm School, would be relevant for New South Wales. And it was he who introduced me to Nick Kay that led to ... and all of you as part of the enthusiasm for that school that opened recently. So we're going to hear Peter himself. He'll be out in Australia. So that's the 9th of November. And then in the standard organised series on the 22nd of November, we're hearing from Leslie Hughes on climate change and what scientists can do in that space, particularly the role of the scientist in public discourse. And of course, Leslie's been one of those people working in climate change well before it was fashionable, and a great leading thinker as well as a great scientist. So Leslie will finish the year's breakfast series on the 22nd of November. Looking forward to seeing you so on the 9th, on the 22nd, and Bert, thank you for entertaining us with a truly and informing us on a wonderful talk today. See you soon.